Okay, I need to clear up some of the confusion that I've created with the very last assignment. That is, the assignment that's called Part A and Part B. I need to clear up what it is that you're supposed to do, and I plan to do that. Before I do that, however, I would appreciate it if you folks keep in mind that I have to have everything graded by May the 2nd, pardon me. So if you are not yet finished with one or more of the assignments, please finish up. And for the folks at Riverside High School, I have 2 classes of you, and I have 1 class at Ripley with high school students. All of you will need to finish up at the same time. Even though your semester in high school lasts longer, your college course here in speech communication, in public speaking, is going to be completed no later than May the 1st. Otherwise, you'll get an incomplete and you won't graduate from high school. So you'd have to finish it up during the summer and get your diploma late, let's just say it that way. And we don't want that. So we want everybody, and especially I'm talking to the high school students, talk to your buddies and make sure that they know that they can get this thing done and they can get it done on time. And the last moment you need to get it done is May 1st. Okay, let me explain next what it is that you must do to complete this very last assignment that's called Part A and Part B. And I hope that this will clear it up. One way or another, we're going to get this done together. I know this has been probably rather miserable for you all because you don't have just this class online. Every class that you have is online. And it's not so pleasant to do a class this way. And it's actually more complex to do a class this way. It's difficult to give directions on paper, so I'm going to try to do a better job verbally and showing you visually what it is I'm looking for on this very last assignment. People aren't really having trouble with any of the others. It's only the last one that I put in, and that's the one that's called Part A and Part B. What you all see in blue are the parts of the outline. With every speech, there is supposed to be an introduction. That's how you get into the speech, get people's attention. There is also supposed to be the body of the speech, where you get into the details of it. And at the end, there's a concluding part. So we'll talk first about the introduction. And what I'm going to show you as a model is that second amendment speech. It was about 23 pages that I showed you in Part A as an example. So I'm going to make it clear. Now, there are several ways to start a speech. Startling statement, rhetorical question, quotation, story, or illustration. A startling statement. I'll give you an example. Hi, I'm Mark, and I'm an alcoholic. Now, I could use that kind of start, that kind of introduction to a speech to get your attention, and then I could talk about a 12-step program. The second type of introduction to get attention and to head in a right direction so that people kind of know what you're going to talk about is a rhetorical question. A rhetorical question. That is a question to which the answer is obvious, or to which the answer to the question will become obvious during the speech. How many of you had difficulty with this speech? That would be a rhetorical question, because I think in explaining this, I've made it more difficult than
it had to be. So that would be a rhetorical question. The answer to it is obvious. Just about everybody had some difficulty. Now, the third one that you see in green there is what you're actually going to see that I began this Second Amendment speech with, and that's why it's in green. Quotation is one of the ways to begin. So I'll show you the way I began in that Second Amendment speech, if we can get to it. All right, so this is a quotation, and the quotation is the Second Amendment itself. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And then I show you where I got it from. Just 27 words that say and mean so much in so little space using so few words. So it's simply a quotation to get started, and what we're talking about here is firearms for self-protection or just about any other reason in the United States of America. So that is how I began the speech that I wrote on the Second Amendment, and that's a perfect place to start. So I used a quotation in this particular case. And you saw the whole speech in Part A that is still out there for you to look at, the whole speech. I'm just going to show pieces of it and show you how it fits this outline of a way that I want you to give a speech. So the first part of the outline is referred to as introduction. And in this particular case, I used the device of the quotation to begin it, and the quotation is appropriate if you're going to talk about the Second Amendment, which I'm going to do. Now, the next part of the introduction, which I'll get down to here, is referred to as the thesis. And in this particular case, I am giving you an example in green that shows 3 points that I would begin a speech on the subject of the war in Iraq. So I'm going to read that for you, and this thesis will have 3 obvious points in it. The United States should exit Iraq. Remember, this is just an example. That's all it is. And then I'm going to show you the one that I actually used for the Second Amendment. The United States should exit Iraq immediately because our being there is not worth the cost in American lives. That's point 1. Nor the cost to U.S. taxpayers. That's point 2. Plus, the Iraqi people are not assuming responsibility for their own country. The Iraqi people is the third point. So when I get to the main body of the speech, I'm going to talk in this example about, first, the cost in American lives. Second, I'll talk about the cost to U.S. taxpayers. And third, I will talk about the Iraqi people taking control of their own country. So this is just a sample thesis. Then I'm going to show you a thesis that is associated with that Second Amendment speech that I already got started with a quotation by quoting the Second Amendment itself from the Constitution. So here is the thesis itself for the actual speech of the Second Amendment. And it too has 3 points, and you'll see those in large print there. Determining what the Second Amendment means are grammar, that's my point 1, and common sense, that's my point 2, and Supreme Court decisions. Then when I get into the body of the speech on the Second Amendment, I will deal with each one of those points in detail. So if you look, what I did first, I want to use a transition word. And here is the example of the transition word that I want you to use. And here it is, that same transition word that I used for the sample Second Amendment speech. First, so that you know I'm talking about my first point, we must consider grammar. So I'm going to talk about grammar in great detail. Now, I'm not going to do that here, but in the speech itself, you can go look at it. I did that in great detail, and it was quite lengthy. So This is the way that you would begin the first point on the Second Amendment that deals with the subject of grammar in those 27 words that I introduced to you at the very first of the speech to get your attention. I used a quotation, if you'll recall. Now, we're going to look at the bare bones second part. And if you look at that, second, there is common sense that comes from characters in history who guide us as to the meaning of these 27 words, from people in the know, people who were around when the Second Amendment was written. Now, if you look at this up here, common sense was my second point. And you'll note that I say it, and it coordinates with, in red there, it coordinates absolutely the way I organize the body, point by point. The way I organize the body is according to the order that you see it in this thesis statement, which you see in red highlighted by yellow. So I already talked about the first point without getting into detail. Grammar, and I use the word first to introduce it so students could know, or whoever's listening would know that I'm doing the first thing. And second deals with common sense. So in this particular case, to flesh it out, what I would do is I would talk about people who lived at that period of time and would quote some things that they had said. The founders of this country, for example. Edmund Burke, who wrote a history, British, and he wrote a history about the Second Amendment, and such men as Jefferson, Madison, Adams, and so on. So those are the people that I would deal with on this second point. There is common sense. That's the way I would flesh that one out. So first, grammar. Second, common sense. And then let's look at what we do third. I talked about Supreme Court rulings. So third, I would use that exact transition word, just as I used first and second earlier. There must be a consideration of court rulings, ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court, wherein resides the final determination of meaning in matters constitutional, trumping both grammar and common sense, the grammar and common sense that I have already talked about. So I would go into detail on the third point of various court decisions. I'm not doing it here. I'm just showing you how the bare bones of this outline would look, with an introduction where I begin with a quotation. Also in the introduction where I told you what I was going to talk about, grammar, common sense, and court decisions. Then the body of it, I would do first grammar, second common sense, and third court decisions. And we're on the third one right now. Then we get to the concluding part of the speech. And again, I've given you no details in the speech. This is just a skeletal outline of how I want you to take Delegate Freitas's speech in Part B and do the same thing, organizing it like I organized my Second Amendment speech, and I'm showing you the bare bones of it here, the way that I want you to organize it. So it'll have an introduction with an attention-getting part. It will have a thesis in the introduction, and then the body will cover all 2 or 3 or 4, however many points you have that are written up in the thesis. The thesis will be one sentence and one sentence alone. All right, so now we're past the introduction. We're past the body of the speech where we go into all the details and the research and all that. Now we're trying to conclude it. So I give an example. I explain what's supposed to be in the conclusion, and there are 2 parts of it. There are 2 transition phrases that you use. In summary, that you see there in red, in summary, and you just give a brief explanation of what you've already covered in the last 10 minutes or so of the speech that you've done. So I'm going to tell you the summary that I did in the Second Amendment speech, that 23-page speech, which is written out for you as an example. In summary, I have spoken for some time on only 27 words, using many more words than that to explain those 27 words. I have done that using an English grammarian quoted in the National Review Online. I have done that with historical context quotations from men living during the time of the Constitution's formulation. I have done that by mentioning recent court decisions in Washington, D.C. and in Chicago, where the Supreme Court has ruled that the keeping and bearing of firearms is an individual right. Case closed. That summarizes what I've talked about in the last, well, it would take me about 40 minutes to deliver that speech. So I would say case closed, and it took me 40 minutes to close the case. Now I get down to the concluding part. I've done the summary, and I said in summary, now we're going to bring it to an absolute close. And in this particular case, the absolute close, you have the same tools that you can use to end it: a startling statement, a rhetorical question, a quotation or story or illustration. And in this particular case, I use an illustration, several illustrations, to end it. And I use the transition phrase, in conclusion. So I'm going to read it to you. In conclusion, it makes little sense that our top elected officials in large cities, all states in the nation's capital, all these are protected by armed bodyguards for the purpose of preventing harm or death to a big city mayor, a governor, or the president. Common U.S. citizens expect the same level of prevention protection for themselves when they choose to arm themselves. It is our right to do so. If the Second Amendment is confusing to some people these days, the confusion is not the fault of the amendment's author, James Madison, or the rest of the founders. Rather, the confusion is mainly due to the success of gun prohibition organizations in trying to convince the public that the right of the people really means the power of the government. All right, so just a quick review here. You will organize that speech I asked you to organize on "We Won't Be a Socialist Country" by Delegate Freitas in Part B. You will organize it with an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. If need be, you will write some things in there using your own words, not just his, so that in the introduction there is a startling statement, a rhetorical question, a quotation, a story or illustration to start it off with. And since he doesn't really have a thesis statement with 2, 3, or 4, or however many points, you will write a thesis statement that fits and works with the rest of his words. Now, that was the thesis statement that I wrote for the Second Amendment. You'll write this is this is not the thesis statement. This is the quotation that I used to start it to get people's attention. Now let's go down to the thesis. The thesis here consisted of 3 points, and with Delegate Freitas' speech, you will have to make one of your own, use your own words to make a thesis statement for him, and then work in his words so that it agrees with your thesis statement. Also, he didn't use these transition words that I use, first, second, third, fourth, whatever. And he didn't say in summary and in conclusion. So you'll want to work that into Delegate Freitas' speech as well. So there is the thesis statement. Just as a review, you'll notice it's one sentence. It has 3 points. And the body deals one by one with each of those points. So the first one deals with grammar. The second one deals with common sense. The third one deals with the Supreme Court considerations. And then you have finished the body of it with all of the supporting material that Fridas already has. And then you get to the conclusion, and you'll need to fix this so that it has a summary, and you may need to write it so that it has a summary, and you see here an example of a summary of the Second Amendment. And then you need to have a conclusion that in this particular case I used an illustration, but you can use a startling statement, a rhetorical question, a story, or illustration. So it has introduction, body, conclusion. The conclusion has two parts, a summary and a conclusion, where you can choose one of four ways to end it. The introduction basically has two parts. It has the attention-getting part, which can be startling statement, rhetorical question, quotation, story, or illustration. I used a quotation. And realistically, also in the introduction, even though I didn't put that here correctly, but it's still there before we get into the main part of it. The thesis is the next part, and it's really part of the introduction, not the body. And so the body consists of the various component parts of the thesis. And in this particular case, the thesis had three parts to it: grammar, common sense, and Supreme Court decisions. I showed you how I covered all of those, and I used those transition words, first, second, third. And when I got down to the conclusion, I used the transition phrases in summary and in conclusion. And in conclusion in this particular case was an illustration that I used. So you need to, using your own words when necessary, using your own words when necessary, add to Fridas's speech so that it conforms to this kind of organization here that I laid out for you from the speech that I wrote. And I gave you the bare bones of it. Now you have not just the bare bones that you see here, but you have the entire speech of Fridas, and so you'll want to organize all those words that he used and add whatever words so that it will agree with this form of organization that I've laid out for you. So I trust that you will be able to understand this now and that it will all work out for you in the end. So if you go through this video a couple of times, maybe you'll get it the first time. So you just do what I've done here, but instead of just doing it bare bones, first, second, third, you'll have all of Fridas's words that will be associated with first, second, and third, and you will create for him a thesis statement. And you will create for him a summary, and you will create for him a conclusion. And it should follow one of these things right here: story, illustration, rhetorical question, startling statement. So if you need to, go over this video more than once, and what you're doing is you're taking what you see here and you're doing this same sort of thing organizationally with Fridas's speech in Part B that I have shown you here simply as an illustration so you can do the Fridas speech. Thank you very much, and I wish you well. And if you still have some troubles one way or another, we're going to get you through it and you'll get it right. Thank you.